Good evening, everyone. My name is Madalina Iacob. I'm a co-managing editor of That Wire North America. I'm happy to have Wariz
You did
Anifowoshe
great. You did great. A
here
lot
with
better
us.
than all my grade school teachers. You're doing wonderful.
He has a great last name, right? Nigerian, right? It means someone that overcomes obstacles.
More or less, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to have you here. Wariz is a managing director, and he is the head of restructuring at Fortress Investment Group. I was a little bit nervous. I thought you couldn't make it in a way because your baby is
Yeah,
coming. It's due very soon.
coming soon, yeah.
But I'm happy you're here.
Likewise, I'm happy to be here.
So let's start the discussion about you, Wariz. Tell us briefly about your role at Fortress and how you got there.
Yeah, so I'm the head of restructuring at Fortress Investment Group. Kind of oversee anything that kind of falls in that area. So restructurings, LMEs, any transactions for loans that are kind of either in a distressed situation, might need some attention, some workout, or any opportunities that we're looking at that are in that distressed space from a new money opportunity.
And Fortress is known to provide credit solutions across liquid and private credit, and to be a long-term partner to companies. Can you talk about how that shapes your investment strategy?
Yeah, at Fortress, we have a focus on, doing great investing, having great relationships with our partners, whether they be sponsors, and, trying to drive returns for our LPs. I think when, you're thinking about it from a holistic standpoint, it all comes down to asset management. You want to make great investments, and then once you make those investments, you want to nurture them and watch them. And so part of that is sometimes investments have trouble, sometimes situations happen. And so at Fortress, the viewpoint is when we're looking at something from a restructuring standpoint or a stress standpoint, it's to see, all right, how can we work with our partners to drive a solution? What's the way to get the best value to our LPs? And how should we approach that situation? And that kind of like is a full team effort. And when I kind of work with them to look at that team, kind of evaluate the different options that you have, and try to understand, what the different stakeholders need in that, kind of lay it out, and then come up with the best solution.
Nice. Let's move on and talk about the current market backdrop, because I think everybody is interested to know exactly how is Fortress navigating this volatile environment and staying nimble. I'm curious to know how are you positioning your investment strategy across the capital structure given this volatility caused by tariffs.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said volatility. I would say like volatility is a good thing. It breeds opportunity. I think we're kind of looking at the whole portfolio. So, areas of opportunity where maybe an investment makes sense, and then looking defensively and saying, all right, we have these investments, they might be exposed to tariffs. How do we think about it? How do we analyze whether or not something needs to be done? Should we be proactive? Do we reach out to the company and say, hey, we understand you might have trouble. We're here to help. We want to be a provider. I think, from a larger scale, we think there's a lot of opportunity in private credit. I think there's a lot of opportunity to, make money if you can make the right investments. There's going to be winners and losers. But you kind of hit the nail on the head when you said there's volatility. You have to be nimble. And part of the viewpoint at Fortress is every time you're evaluating an opportunity, every time you're asset managing your book, you need to be nimble. You need to be smart. Talk to people around the industry that know what they're doing, and kind of make the best decisions you can.
So are there areas where you're leaning in more aggressively or conversely pulling back from, given what's happening?
I think right now everyone's in evaluation mode. I think that, like, obviously when you know that your asset has a lot of risk to tariffs, if you can pull back, if you can find a way to de-risk the situation, you're always going to attack it that way. So if you told me that, like, we're looking through the book and there's things that like are exposed, you're going to approach them. If you think there's some great opportunities where this company is fundamentally good and we might have a relationship with a sponsor, of course you want to take the opportunity to try to say, hey, we're here, we want to be a partner, offer some new money, figure that out. And there are a number of situations that we evaluate where some great relationships we have with sponsors are saying, hey, we're doing well, we need to navigate this. Can you come up with a new money opportunity? Can you figure out if we can get the group to do something? And at Fortress, we always want to be able to do that because at the end of the day, all of this stuff, and I know we're going to talk about some liability management and stuff like that later, like it all just comes down to relationships. So I would say you're absolutely leaning into those relationships being very strong. And it's a great opportunity right now because there are some investments that people think are bad that we actually think are great. And that gives you an opportunity, whether it is to provide new money or to get into debt or any other transactions.
Can you give us some examples? Some specific sectors or subsectors where we are thinking that some investments are great.
Well, I think that right now,
Where you think restructuring could pick up, or groups are
yeah, I think
maybe
that, yeah. So if you
organizing.
it asked me, like, what I'm seeing as the busiest sectors in the restructuring LME world right now, a lot of talk about healthcare, a lot of things about transportation logistics. There's been a lot of tech names. We fortunately were able to avoid some of those high-profile tech names that have been doing LMEs and restructurings. And there's been a decent amount of consumer that's been popping up, all the stuff that kind of makes sense. But I would say that, like, at least from my perspective, there's been a decent amount in, call it your healthcare, your tech, packaging, and to a lesser degree, some consumer.
Is there a place where you find these good investments, like a specific sector that you think, or is just obviously situational?
Well, given just the distressed nature, everyone's a unique, little snowflake. So I think you can find some great investments in every sector. I think you can find some terrible investments in every sector.
Yeah.
I wouldn't give, I do think that there are some sectors that once people get the flavor of, like, every single lawyer or banker's on it and there's a bunch of LME or restructuring going on it, people decide they're going to throw babies out with bathwater. And so, like, that's when you can kind of say, hey, this business is actually different than these three businesses. So we might like it. So, like, all right, like, everyone's throwing out these names in packaging, but there might be some opportunities that are like, everyone doesn't like healthcare, but actually, like, these two healthcare companies are exposed in a different way and you want to be involved.
Definitely. So let's move on. You mentioned LMEs. I'm curious. You've been involved in a number of LMEs. How have they evolved in the past years? I mean, Scott talked recently how they became more inclusive. I'm curious to have your view from the other side of the.
Yeah, I mean, I think objectively that's probably correct. Right, Scott said that they are more inclusive than they've been in the past. I think if you go to the LME 1.0 or however you want to look at it, or 0.0, a lot of those transactions were get to 50%, do a transaction, leave about the other 49%. That flavor of transaction is very rare. You're seeing, like, you guys report on it, a deal will get launched with 80, 90 something percent participation. Now, what a lender would say is that participation might be stratified in there with different tiers, but I think that the viewpoint is that at the end of the day, people like to say LMEs and creditor to creditor violence, but what you're really trying to do is you're trying to find a solution for a company or a sponsor. And so, like, sponsor has an issue, the company has an issue, they might be trying to get duration, they might need liquidity to give them more opportunity to see if they can monetize the asset or turn it around. And one of the tools that they can use based on the documents is liability management. And that tool can be used in a lot of different ways. Some of it's very consensual, some of it's not consensual. And I brought up the fact that these things are unique, and I do stress that because there are a lot of transactions where things are very much becoming a lot more try to get to 100%, try to do it per hour. And then you'll see transactions where the needs of the sponsor or the needs of lenders who are running it might lead to something that's less per hour. I think that in general, there is a viewpoint in the market of you are better off trying to get as high as participation as possible. But that's also a truism because the larger the participation is, the more discount the company or the sponsor is capturing, which inherently means that the business is in a better position because it has less debt load. So I think that everyone is incentivized to try to get participation to as close to 100%, both for the obvious reasons of, like, this is better for the business, and also, like, from avoiding the headlines. Even though I know you guys like headlines over Getwire, it's really if you announce a deal with 99% participation, people view that as a success. That's a positive thing. The likelihood of litigation and noise and distraction and moving away. What Fortress always wants to stress is that at the end of the day, this is there are businesses behind all these transactions. They employ people, they want to operate. And the way that lenders and sponsors will drive the best returns is if the business turns around. Right? My favorite type of LME is the LME where the business then gets the runway, it turns around, EBITDA grows, and you can exit at par and do better. The sponsor gets equity value, everybody wins.
I mean, we have to look at some data, but a lot of them, I feel like they end up into a second LME or into a Chapter 11, right?
But
it is a way to kick the can down the road.
So all this stuff, if you step away and look at it, just look at it from a math perspective, it's just about maximizing probabilities. So everyone says if an LME ends in bankruptcy, is that a failure? Depends upon what the goal is. All an LME is, if you strip away all the fanfare about it, is by executing this transaction, you are providing the stakeholders with a longer runway to determine whether or not the business can make it. So if we say we're going to do this LME, there's going to be a maturity extension, there's going to be liquidity, there's going to be discount capture, all those different things, it might work out. Like in the case of some businesses you did in COVID, like, hey, this is a temporary dislocation. We just need some time. We can't, with a working capital crunch, we need some liquidity. And those deals worked out great. Some of them did not work out great. But if you play it out, your alternative is, all right, I don't want to do the LME, I don't want to do the transaction. So you could do a restructuring. The restructuring may or may not work out. As you know, there are plenty of restructurings.
Extremely expensive.
It's very expensive. There are plenty of restructurings that end in 22s because you're making decisions with limited information, right?
Right, I just filed today. 20, yeah.
So, it comes down to say, all right, right now we're at a market uncertainty. There's uncertainty right now with tariffs, other things. Do I want to do a transaction that does two things? It allows you as a lender and allows the sponsor to buy more time to evaluate the business, to evaluate what the administration is doing, to evaluate the economy. And then you can make a more informed decision, whether that be a second LME, like we said, or a restructuring, or hopefully the business picks up and it works out.
I want to ask you, just post CERTA and Mitel, have you seen any change in documents? Are lawyers giving you other options to kind of circumvent CERTA and the open market purchase?
Yeah, I think
in the past 5 months, yeah.
Yeah, so in the past 5 months, you've seen multiple transactions that basically kind of just viewed CERTA as a decision that was made. Well, I'll take a step back. I think that there is sometimes a misunderstanding of these decisions and a misunderstanding of how LME works. And what I mean by that is that, there are, some of your competitors, whatever, have these checklists for people on a BSL or something to say, hey, does it have sort of protection? Does it have J-Crew protection? Does it have these things? And that's all well and good, but it misses the larger point, right? The point is there a way that an enterprising lawyer, can analyze a document and determine a way to give one group more than the other group to move value to the sponsor, the equity holders, away from the lenders? If that exists, then the path for an LME exists. And so when you ask the question of these decisions, obviously you've seen BetterHelp and you've seen other deals like Oregon Tool, people are still able to execute transactions around it. Once you realize that the premise of it is, does the lawyer have a mechanism to effectuate the transaction? The individual cases start to mean less. And then if you look at the new issue market, which I know you guys follow well, a lot of those new issues explicitly permit what the judge said sort of didn't allow. So you'll see them say open market purchases means private exchanges, and they have a whole listing explicitly permitting that, which goes back to my earlier point of, at the end of the day, right, an LME is being permitted in the doc because sponsors want their documents to have the flexibility. Lenders, we compete in the market. If you want to have access to capital, you have to have documents that the borrowers want to take. And it's been pretty clear that the borrowers like that flexibility, and the lenders who provide that flexibility are able to deploy capital.
Recently, they tried to include some anti-co-op language in some deals, right? So since we're talking about documentation.
And those were rejected.
Right? So I'm curious, what stands out right now in terms of documentation from your experience, from what you've seen?
Yeah, I think
recently?
you kind of hit the nail on the head there, right? Anti-co-op language has been tried to put in a lot of documents, and it's failed to get in so far. And I think that kind of highlights the point that the market has its limits. Right? Right now, no one is in favor, broadly speaking, of having that language in, which is why it hasn't get in. I don't know what the future holds. I think that sponsors will continue to try to get that language in there because at the end of the day, it provides them more flexibility if they're able to get it in. I think that right now you're seeing, if you look at the new issue market, that the flexibility, particularly for sponsors that have the reputation, it still exists. They're getting a lot of the new issue BSL. I would actually wager to guess that if the market doesn't improve, and you're standing here and talking to someone else in 2031, right, looking at a 2027 document that has all these, looseness for 2026, 2025, I think that you'll see that in some ways LME is easier in those documents, right? There's no CERTA issue because it explicitly permits private exchanges and all these things. There's no other issues because like the document explicitly permits XYZ movement. Um, in some ways, the benefit of that is that everybody wants to get the bargain of their deal, right? When people are upset about deals, everyone wants to bargain. So if you have a document that explicitly allows some LME, in some ways you're better off because you can say, hey, I'm making a calculated decision to be in this to be in this deal that has this document with these covenants. Whereas I think part of the reason you have so much, fanfare and news around it right now is that it's unclear if everybody was understood exactly what all the different provisions meant. I think everyone understands them now, and they got up to speed. And at Fortress, like one of the things that we pride ourselves is taking care to read the documents, work with counsel, and understand them because that's how you can evaluate your risk, right? And you just have to make a calculated, probability-weighted decision on whether or not you think it makes sense.
I mean, you talked about reading the documents. Is there any time that you would look through bond indentures or credit agreements to look for to pull an LME, to say this could be an interesting opportunity as an investment strategy, or you find yourself mostly pulled into the LMEs because you're a big lender and then you're part of a steer co and so on?
So for any of the situations that come into my world, I'm always evaluating it holistically to know. I need to know exactly what they can do. So the first thing I need to know is what can the sponsor do without speaking to lenders? Because the documents have baskets in there where the sponsors can execute a transaction by themselves. That's first. Then I say, all right, how is this document structured? Talk to counsel. What can the sponsor do with required lenders? Typically, that's almost anything. But you evaluate that. And then based upon that evaluation, and then based upon the situation you're in, you make a determination. And so you'll know, all right, here's the leverage the group has. Here's the leverage I have as an investor. And to your point, from an asset management perspective, we're always looking at anything that falls into stress to say, should we be front-footed? Should we go talk to other lenders? Should we call the sponsor? We have a great relationship with them. You guys need a solution. And then you just package a solution based upon the situation. But our goal is always, like I said, to keep those relationships, work with that, and come to solutions that drive value for our LPs.
And you talked about groups organizing before. I'm curious, do you feel like a co-op is a useful tool or an overused hammer? How do you decide when to make it into a co-op? How do you decide when you would enter into a co-op or not?
Yeah, I think it's a useful tool. I think that all of these things are tools, right? And a co-op, other types of agreement, they have benefits and they have drawbacks. And when you evaluate a situation, you have to determine whether or not using that tool is going to benefit, your stakeholders. And so, as you know, there's a million different types of co-ops. There are co-ops that are 100% co-ops, which have a very specific use. There are co-ops that are 50% co-ops, which have a different use. And even within a co-op, not all co-ops are the same. Some co-ops are 100% pro rata. Some co-ops have carve-outs. Some co-ops can be broken by a smaller percentage of the lenders. Some co-ops can only be broken by everybody. And so you have to kind of evaluate the situation. Where are you positioned? What do you think about the business on the underlying fundamental basis? And then as you evaluate internally, we come up with the idea of all right, we think it makes sense to be in a co-op. And then it's all right, we think it makes sense to be in co-op, we think it makes sense to be in this type of co-op. And you make those determinations based upon the situation. One of the beauties of this entire business and why I like credit so much is that each one of these situations are unique, right? Someone will say, I want to use this playbook, but if the document is different, if the other lenders are different, if the sponsor is different, if the needs of the business are different, it'll lead to a completely different transaction, despite on the face of it seeming to be very similar.
But relationships are the same, right?
Relationships matter a great deal. I mean, the fundamental premise of a loan document is that required lenders have to be able to make decisions for the entire loan. And so if you think about what that means, particularly in the broadly syndicated market, that means having relationships, even just through a basic amendment. Let's put LME completely aside. If you wanted to provide an amendment to provide additional time for the company to provide reporting, you have to be able to have conversations with other lenders. It's this makes a lot of sense. We should do it. Here's what you might charge, here's what you might not charge. That just comes back to relationships. And so with this business in particular, when you're evaluating a circumstance, right? Everyone says, all right, well, if you don't do the LME, that might be the move. But if you don't do the LME, it's all right, we're going to do a restructuring. If I'm doing a restructuring, I need a relationship even more. Because now, if you're doing restructuring and you're equitizing and you end up on the other side potentially owning a business, which is never like a lender's goal when they're becoming when they get into the credit, now you have to be able to operate on a board with 7, 6, 10, 15 other lenders. And so that relationship and that understanding and that trust is important.
I don't think have you been on that side recently, like owning companies? Not too much, right? It's more LME.
Yeah,
It's more like
it's never the goal if a Fortress to own a company through a process. But as you know, sometimes Chapter 11s happen. It's never what anybody wants. I don't think there's a single lender here who would get on this mic and say that's ever a goal. But it happens, right? There's situations where we were a lender and then became equity. Fortunately, those are relatively rare, but they happen.
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple more questions. Not everyone's at the top of the stack the way Fortress is most of the time, and kind of controlling the structure of the LME. What advice do you give to the smaller lenders trying to protect themselves in complex capital structures and complex LME situations?
I don't give any advice currently, but if I was,
we have to ask Scott for a lawyer for
he's
an
a
advice.
Lawyer, correct. I'm out of the.
Or Glenn Ager, they are the ones organizing the minority lenders.
I'm out of the advice business. I did a great time when I was an advisor at Evercore, but I don't do advice.
Well, let's put that hat back on and see.
But in concept, it's the same thing, right? I'm not the largest in every capital structure. But it goes back to, as silly as it seems, it comes back to very active asset management. You need to identify your names early, and then you have to make a decision, right? You can get bigger in the name if you feel good about the fundamental business. You can sell out of it if you say, you know what, I think that this price, based upon everything that's going on, makes sense. Or if you're in a situation where you can't get bigger for whatever reason, you can't sell out for whatever reason, and you want to be a part of the process, you can try to move early and try to get other lenders. But it comes down to, what are your relationships with other lenders? So if I'm some small lender in a group and there's some larger lenders, if you have a great relationship with those lenders and you're larger in something else, you can probably figure out something to do. But it's kind of it seems a little trite, but at the end of the day, it's like, if you're a small lender and you know a process is coming and you want to be part of that process, then you have to invest the shoe leather and the time to get to know the people who are involved in that process. I wish there was that's really the only advice I could give. I know I'm not in that business. Is that you have to have a lot of active management, see the situation before it goes wrong if you can, and then if you can't, at that point you have to say, all right, how is this structured? What can I do? Who do I can talk to, and kind of go from there.
I think we're almost wrapping up here.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you if, just to give us some thoughts about your outlook. I know you don't have a crystal ball and it's hard, but what's the biggest opportunity right now? I think you were talking earlier how it's kind of hard to build a big position in this market, right? I guess in a way, with all the volatility and people are frozen in a way and not trading sometimes.
Yeah, I don't know.
Where do you see an opportunity now?
I think right now there's a lot of opportunities. I think there's some great opportunities in private credit. I think there's some great opportunities to provide capital and be a partner. When things are choppy, right, people are going to be afraid to put capital to work. But the beauty of that is if you have relationships with, sponsors and companies who are going to need liquidity to navigate it, we want to lean into that. We want to keep developing those relationships, deploying that capital to people that make sense, to companies we believe in. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity there from a liquidity perspective. I mean, obviously all the tariff headwinds everyone sees in the news, that uncertainty, people want to build moats. They want to say, all right, I don't know what I'm going to need. I don't know what's going to look like. Let me get liquidity. So there's going to be opportunities there. I think on the broader LME market, I think that there's going to continue to be LME. I think that, as a result of just the way the documents are structured, and more importantly, the way that sponsors are situated, right now they need time to kind of turn around their companies and wait until there's a better market to exit. I mean, you see all the headlines about exiting PE investments. So time is really valuable right now. And as a result of that, there's going to be a lot of need to find solutions, to find companies and sponsors time so they can realize investments.
I think your preferred place is a non-fungible first lien loan, right?
So there's a lot of opportunities in that, right? Handling that, you can do non-fungible first lien loans. to kind of deal with near-dated maturities, to provide liquidity to companies that need it. Um, and at Fortress, we really think that like right now is where you show people what partnership means. It's a lot easier to say like everyone can write a loan in 2017 when things were flying high. You know, it takes like a little bit of a different type of analysis and willingness to lean in to figure out the right opportunity to do a loan when things are different.
Thank you so much, Wariz.
Yeah.
Good luck with your upcoming baby. We're very excited for you and your family.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for your time today.